Good day. We're moving on to our next module with Criterion Reference Assessments, what I am calling the wide world of Criterion Reference Assessments. And why I'm calling it that is because the types of assessments that are available that fall under this umbrella are so wide and so vast. I thought what we could do is celebrate the spectrums or spectra of Criterion Reference Assessments out there, and in doing so, thinking about a couple of different dimensions. So one, thinking about the spectrum of standardization or reliability that we see in some of our Criterion Reference Assessments. Some are highly standardized, some are very unstandardized. You might use that term I used before, informal, but I really like thinking of it more on the spectrum of standardization and how that impacts the reliability. I also would like to think about the spectrum of authenticity, and I have a few different concepts of getting that across. And really thinking about, are we doing an assessment that is capturing a student's ability to communicate? And our Criterion Reference Assessments, they can vary on that dimension as well, and that's okay, right? We're celebrating the spectrums that we're seeing here, and we're going to end up today with some case examples and how we're showing these considerations when we're choosing the different tests that we're picking. So the first concept I want to get across, this is something that we all learned in graduate school and we think about with our tests, is standardization, which really relates to reliability. If I give a test, am I going to get consistent results across time? If I'm giving a test on Monday, is it going to be similar to Wednesday? And that's going to be similar to next Friday, right? And the way we talk about this within psychometrics is test, retest, reliability. And our norm reference tests are really set up well for this. So, I just tried to bring in some emojis and showing how we could get some tests that are very unreliable, right? They might not be very standardized. We're getting in the morning when you're happy, and in the afternoon when you're tired. If that has an impact on your performance, we could see very different types of performance. We can contrast that with something that's more highly standardized and is going to be more reliable, more consistent over time, right? So if we give an assessment that's highly standardized, every student is getting the same materials, every student is scored the same way, we're being really consistent in how we're collecting that data, we should get relatively consistent data from our assessments. I don't want to oversell any of these concepts, right? We are working with human performance, with language and speech and communication. So it's not like it's going to be perfectly reliable, but we can see how this generally is more reliable than that first example I provide. We're getting consistent, mostly consistent data throughout time. So our assessments, especially our Criterion Reference Assessments, they're really going to vary. There's going to be a lot of variability in how standardized they are, right? So I'm going to show some examples and kind of help you think through that. And the more standardized an assessment is, the more reliable it tends to be, right? So let's look at a couple of examples here. One, I tried to get two ranges of the spectrum. One, we could have, just popping into a random classroom at a random point in the day and looking just for, overall communication skills. Now, there's a lot of opportunity for not being as reliable in that, or not being very standardized. All right, what specific skills am I looking at? What classroom am I going into? What time of day is it? What's the curriculum that they're using? What's the content that they're covering? So I'm not saying that, popping in and doing an observation is bad. That's data that we want to get. We just want to think about how standardized is this process and how reliable are the data. We can contrast that with our norm reference tests, which tend to be more standardized, right? They tend to have all the students doing the same tasks, same direction, same materials, and we tend to get a bit more reliable data, all right? I'm not saying one is better than the other necessarily. I'm just trying to get across this concept of standardization. Now, I don't, again, want to oversell any particular test and how reliable it is. We're dealing with human performance, so it's not like we're dealing with something very highly standardized like manufacturing of microchips or anything like that. That's way more standardized and precise. There's way more variability. In fact, I think this is probably a more accurate rendition of where we are on this standardized reliability spectrum, if not this, where we are still always going to have measurement error. We want to think about the spectrum and the level of error and standardization. So what's a way that we can make an informal test more standardized or more reliable? Let's take the example of narrative skills, right? So there's different ways we know that narrative skills are important. One way that we could assess the student's narrative skill would be go into the library or go into their classroom and just pull a book off of the shelf. And we could look at that book with the student and maybe have them retell whatever the story is in there. And we can look at some of our developmental charts to interpret that. But there's some things with this scenario that are going to be a threat to the standardization process or the reliability of that. Right? One is, what's the nature of the book? If I just go and pick a random book, we know there's wide variability in the complexity of picture books. And then, the complexity of the concepts and the language that's used. And so that could impact the student's ability to complete whatever language task you want to do. We also know that there's going to be variability in how much they've been exposed to the book. Maybe you pull a book that they've been reading every day. This is part of their unit and they have a lot of familiarity with it and they may perform a little bit better, right? We can still look at this concept, this narrative language concept, and look at it in a more standardized way that's going to give us potentially more reliable data. So I'm going to introduce our first criterion reference assessment today that I'll talk about. That's the cubed. The cubed, I think a lot of you have heard about it. This is a comprehensive assessment that looks, I shouldn't use that term. This is an assessment battery, a battery of assessment tools that looks at emergent literacy and including language and narrative. So they, have these more standardized stories that kids can retell. They have these standardized administration instructions and a standardized way of scoring the narratives, and it's been tested and benchmarks provided with benchmark data from students at different ages and grades and things. So we're looking at the same skill, but there's this variability and standardization. Now, I'm not, again, prescribing or saying one is better than the other, but just thinking of the consistency of the data, we're going to get different levels of consistency. I could see a clinical situation where you would want to go into a classroom and see how a student is doing with whatever books they're reading. And let's say, that you have a good relationship with that teacher and you want to open the conversation about the narrative skills that they have. And maybe this particular teacher really has good insights into how students do with the different books that they're focusing on in their curriculum. That may not be, there may be some risk and some threats to the level of reliability and standardization, but that may be really rich data for you to get. So I'll come back to that concept in a little bit. Next, I want to move on to this idea of authenticity, the real world, right? How do your language skills look in the real world? And whenever I use that term real world, I always am taken back to the 1990s and thinking of the old Real World show. But this is actually kind of a nice concept for what we're talking about, because even though that's called the real world, it may not really be that authentic, right? So there's different levels of authenticity, probably more authentic than I Love Lucy or something like that, although that's pretty authentic too, you might say. A bit more authentic, but not as authentic as our real lives, right? Of what we are dealing with our day-to-day lives. So I'm going to present a few different concepts with this. Some of you may be familiar with the International Classification of Functioning. And so we're going to have this spectrum from left to right on all of these different areas, right? So Within this international classification of functioning, activities are the individual activities that we can look at. How do you say words? How do you understand sentences? Within this ICF model, did you break your leg, right? On the other end of the spectrum, something more authentic, something more related to real life is how does that impact your participation, right? So if you broke your leg, that keeps you from doing certain activities like walking. But ultimately, if we're really looking for that authentic capturing of your ability, the participation level is you're on the sideline for that next game. We can see the similar type of thing, with our Criterion reference assessments. We may look at how a child does at producing specific sentences or specific morphemes or specific sounds, and we can get rich information on their activities, but we also want to consider how are they using that language, how are they using those sounds to communicate, how are they getting their needs made, how are they participating in their day-to-day lives. Another concept, I think this is a very related concept, is looking at discrete skills. I think that's similar to the activity level versus the term that we use a lot, educational impact. What's the impact of the communication difficulty that someone's having? So as an example of that, we have a lot of different tests that look at discrete skills. A lot of our language tests for preschool and school-age children look at inflectional morphology. If you want to have a fun memory trip down memory lane to your old undergrad and grad days, the WUG test, right? This is a WUG. Now there's two of them. There are two WUGs is what we're looking for that child to say, and that tells us, do they have third person singular? And we can do rich isn't probably the right word, detailed, in-depth evaluation of these discrete skills. On the other side of the spectrum, we can also look at, how are you using these skills? What's the impact? How are you using these skills to communicate? Can you use that third person singular form to describe things that happen on a regular basis? That's why we use third person singular. Can you use present progressive to describe things that are happening in the here and now? Can you use future or past tense to talk about things that are more out of your immediate context, right? How are you using those language skills in order to communicate? Very related to the curriculum. If we're talking preschool, early childhood, or K4, K5, can you participate in centers? Can you engage with your peers? Can you describe things and describe your needs to your teachers? So just that contrast there. I also want to talk about depth versus breadth, and I'm going to use this opportunity to think about my favorite days of the summer of going to the beach, right? And some days I get very in depth. I look down and I'm looking into individual small parts of the beach for very specific items, for these individual pieces of beach glass. One of my hobbies, one of my pastimes. I know I'm a wild man, but looking for the very specific in-depth examination. We can also think about the breadth, right? The forest from the trees and that metaphor. Really, if we want to think about the beach experience, we can think about the whole, full, wide breadth of the experience. You have the sand, you have the waves, you have the people, you have the snacks, you have the sun, you have the cold water and all of that, right? That's really thinking about it, the whole breadth, the wide experience. And we can do this with our Criterion reference assessments, right? We can go do deep dives. We can look at certain skills with depth. We can do an assessment like the wonderful world or the entire world of R, which does a very in-depth, detailed screening of that sound. Or we could look more broadly at something like the intelligibility and context scale. I'm going to talk about this a few times. Freely available material that I really like and I highly suggest you check out, right? So how are you using those sounds in context? Can other people understand what you're saying? Your immediate family members, other kids, can you communicate clearly? Really looking at that more breadth of the use of that skill. So these aren't perfectly correlated concepts, right? You know, there's some subtle differences, but I think in general they're on similar ends of the spectrum. If we're looking more at that activity level, if we're looking more at how you say words, we're looking more at discrete skills, and we tend to be looking at things in a lot of depth, right? Looking, so if we're doing you could think of this as a subtest of a norm reference test. Also, there will be things like the wonderful world of R and complex syntax assessments where we can look at these particular skills in depth. And that might be really important for us. If we really want to work on that skill, see what level of support's needed, really see where the breakdowns are. I think a lot of our criterion reference assessments are more on this other end of the spectrum. And this is something that, we can really use these types of assessments to capture. And this is something we need to capture within our assessments to see, is there that educational impact? Are the students participating? Are they fully participating in their day-to-day lives? Are they meeting the academic requirements of the school? Are they meeting the social emotional requirements and getting their social emotional needs met? Are we really looking at communication with more breadth and seeing where the breakdown is? So, which is best, depth or breadth? Something that's more reliable or less reliable. And my point for this is, it's not a competition. My point is to just get you thinking about these different levels, these different dimensions of our assessments. And I think it also helps to consider how you're using these assessments within your comprehensive evaluation, right? When I think about comprehensive assessments and comprehensive evaluations, I usually think of a couple of different types of goals. One, I need to make a high stakes decision. That's just the way our speech and language system works. We don't, for the most part, participate in EML, SS, or RTI. We generally have, a comprehensive evaluation that results in a high stakes decision. Sometimes these criterion reference assessments can be really integral to making those decisions, and I'll show some of those examples. And sometimes we have cases where we're kind of on the fence, and we may want to consider something that's possibly more reliable or possibly looking at some discrete skills. Then we also have those cases where it's more a slam dunk as far as eligibility, and we can really have a bit of luxury of looking at the educational impact in intervention planning. I don't think that was the right term to use, luxury, because this is something we have to do all the time, but maybe a bit more confidence in really examining something that's going to lead to really meaningful intervention goals. So I'm going to show a couple of examples from my perspective. I'm not saying this is the right perspective, but this is my perspective of how these assessments can fit into our assessment protocols. So I'm going to do a couple of case studies here. I have a language case study and a couple of speech sound case studies. So let's think about Dylan. Dylan's in first grade and he transitioned into your district. He had received speech and language services in another state. Looking at the documentation, there's pretty clear documentation that he had a language disorder. And giving our norm reference test, we see that he scored quite low on this test and there was a significant discrepancy. So now let's think a little bit about choosing our own adventure. This is kind of more that, I don't want to call it a slam dunk necessarily, but this is where we're less worried about that high stakes decision. We're pretty confident that Dylan has a language disorder. He meets that disability determination criteria. He's eligible for services. So let's think about types of tests that we might want to give. We could give the Peabody. That's very highly reliable, highly standardized. Now let's think about authenticity and deep dive. Yeah, it does a deep dive into receptive vocabulary, but like my last lecture I had with you all, my last video, it's not a great test for really a lot of what we do, right? It's not really a great diagnostic marker for a language disorder. It's not really looking at your ability to participate in the classroom. It's not looking at curricular language. Not really going to be the best choice for us here. We could also go and talk with our classroom teacher. Maybe we have a good relationship with Dylan's classroom teacher, and look at the type of rubrics that they're using, the type of narrative skills that they're doing in the classroom. So we could look at, the narrative rubric that they're using, thinking of that continuum of reliability or standardization. There's some threats here, right? We're not quite sure where this came from. Maybe it came from teachers pay teachers. Hopefully it came from some sort of curriculum that had a level of study and had a level of developmental data supporting it. But I'm not going to lie to you, there's a bit of a risk there. But maybe it's really important to take that risk because this is a very authentic piece of data. This is what he's doing in the classroom. This is what he's expected to do in the classroom. If we have a good relationship and a good trust in the teacher, we can see how does he stand up to his peers, at least in his classroom, and work with that teacher and see, is this an area of need for him? Is this an area where I could provide some support and add value to Dylan's education? Maybe that's a bit of a risk for you and you'd want to do something a little more standardized. I think, so I introduced this cubed before, the narrative language measures. We would have more confidence giving that. In my personal opinion, I think you may give up a little bit of that authenticity compared to a high quality classroom rubric, right? It doesn't quite open the door as much to building that relationship, providing curriculum-based instruction of really working on skills that are directly related to what Dylan's doing in the classroom. So any of three of these could be administered. I would argue that 2 would be really nice assessments to round out Dylan's assessment. And I could be convinced, persuaded either way of either using the classroom rubric or the cubed. And as I'm thinking through which one I'm going to use, maybe if I'm a little more on the fence and I really want to ensure I have high quality, high psychometrically sound data, I'll choose the cubed because there's been more testing done on that and I have more confidence in it. On the other hand, if I'm very confident that Dylan has a true language disorder and that Dylan is going to be eligible for services and I really want to align my supports with what he's doing in the classroom, I may be more persuaded to use that classroom rubric. Let's take a look at the case of Chrissy. Chrissy, first grade student, she has some articulation errors, fair to good stimulability, right? So what are some different assessments that we could do? What might be going through our mind? We could do that deep dive into the world of R, pretty highly standardized, pretty much looking at the activity level, looking with a lot of depth, looking at these discrete skills. And that might be really important for us, if we're really trying to understand where the breakdown is. I think it also would be really important to look at something like the intelligibility and context scale. Are we seeing that this is having an impact on Chrissy's day-to-day life? Are we seeing that it's having an impact on other people being able to understand Chrissy? Are we seeing that it's having an impact on Chrissy's friends being able to understand her, right? So now we're looking at something that, again, I think it still has a good level of standardization and reliability, but looking more at breadth and looking more at that participation level and looking more at how is Chrissy functioning? How are her articulation difficulties impacting her day-to-day life? I also think it'd be really important to look at emergent literacy skills, right? We know that students with speech sound disorders, phonological disorders, are at higher risk for reading difficulties. So can we look at some type of either phonological awareness or emergent literacy or early literacy skills and see, are we having those difficulties? With this example of Chrissy, I'll give what I think I might see with her. With the world of R, I may get really rich data on, it's more those kind of medial and final positions where we're really seeing her have difficulty, more at the sentence and discourse level, less at the word and phrase level. But we may also find that she's really quite intelligible to most people. Her reading phonological awareness is on track and meeting expectations. In that case, I would not feel that there's a large educational impact and Chrissy may not be eligible for services. Let's kind of take a little different look. Let's look at Lizzie. Lizzie is in first grade with multiple phonological processes. We're seeing final consonant deletion. We're seeing cluster reduction. We're seeing stopping. Let's do the same type of deep dive in different areas. World of R. I like giving it. You know what? You can't blame me. It's probably not the best assessment though for Chrissy or for Lizzie in this case, right? We're looking more at multiple phonological processes. Don't really probably need to go into great depth on a specific sound. I think this could be really powerful. Are we seeing that she is lacking intelligibility? Her peers are not able to understand her. It's affecting her social emotional because she can't be understood by her peers. Now we're seeing that real educational impact. Are we also seeing some difficulties with emergent literacy? She's not meeting those milestones. She's scored significantly lower than her peers and for the district level expectations on those early reading skills. Now we're really seeing not only the phonological processes and difficulties, but we're also seeing how that carries over and how it's having an impact on our education. We have a great rationale for providing our intervention to improve intelligibility and to hopefully build a stronger foundation of emergent literacy skills. So those are my 3 examples. I'm trying to keep it under 30 minutes, so I'm just going to talk briefly about our next steps. This week, no application activity. We're just going to meet in a community of practice in a bit. And then you're going to have spring break and it's going to be fantastic. During our community of practice meeting, Alyssa and I really just wanted to open up the discussion. What are you feeling about some of these concepts? I know in her initial coaching session, there were a lot of questions that were being raised. So we thought it would be good to have us meet in small groups and really start to talk through those questions. Like, if there's something like the PALS that's being administered or, a literacy screener that's being used, is that good enough to be one of the assessment tools that I use? What if, can I really make up my own? And if that's the case, how do I do that? Some of these different tools that are available, where do I find them? How do I use them? And how do I interpret these with confidence? We're not going to answer all those questions. We want to just open the discussion. For the rest of the semester, this is just that pilot project, so it's not a deep dive across all of Criterion reference assessment. We're going to introduce a specific assessment that we purchased for the district. We talked with district leadership and thought this would be a good approach. We're going to introduce something called the student language scales, right? So we are going to provide a very clear example of a Criterion reference assessment. We're going to give it to you. We're going to give you opportunities to try it on a student and to see where that goes. And we're going to guide your use of that assessment. So that's what I have for you today. I hope you're having a great week. If you have any questions, you can always reach out to Alyssa or myself. I look forward to talking to you soon.